The world is changed. I feel it.
Why should we care what the Founding Fathers believed or did not believe about religion? They went to such great trouble to insulate faith from politics, and took such care to keep their own convictions private, that it would scarcely matter if it could now be proved that, say, George Washington was a secret Baptist. The ancestor of the American Revolution was the English Revolution of the 1640s, whose leaders and spokesmen were certainly Protestant fundamentalists. But that did not bind the framers, and cannot be said to bind us either. Indeed, the established Protestant Church in Britain was one of the models which we can be quite sure the signatories of 1776 were determined to avoid emulating. Moreover, the 18th century scholars and gentlemen who gave us the U.S. Constitution were in a relative state of innocence respecting knowledge of the cosmos, the earth, and the psyche, of the sort that has revolutionized the modern argument over faith. Charles Darwin was born in Thomas Jefferson's lifetime, on the very same day as Abraham Lincoln, as it happens, but Jefferson's guesses about the fossils found in Virginia were to Darwinism what alchemy is to chemistry, and the insights of Einstein and Freud lay over a still more distant horizon. The furthest that most skeptics could go was in the direction of an indeterminate deism, which accepted that the natural order seemed to require a designer, but did not necessitate the belief that the said designer actually intervened in human affairs. Invocations such as nature's God were partly intended to hedge this bet, while avoiding giving offence to the pious. Even Thomas Paine, the most explicitly anti-Christian of the lot, wrote The Age of Reason as a defence of God from those who traduced him in man-made screeds like the Bible. Considering these limitations, it's quite astonishing how irreligious the founders actually were. You might not easily guess, for example, who was the author of the following words. O Lord, do you think that a Protestant popedom is annihilated in America? Do you recollect, or have you ever attended to the ecclesiastical strifes in Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, and every part of New England? What a mercy it is that these people cannot whip and crop and pillory and roast as yet in the U.S. If they could, they would. There is a germ of religion and human nature so strong that whenever an order of men can persuade the people by flattery or terror that they have salvation at their disposal, there can be no end to fraud, violence, or usurpation. That was John Adams, in relatively mild form. He was also to point out, though without too much optimism, the secret weapon that secularists had at their disposal, namely the profusion of different religious factions. The multitude and diversity of them, you will say, is our security against them all. God grant it. But if we consider that the Presbyterians and Methodists are far the most numerous and the most likely to unite, let a George Whitefield arise with a military caste like Mahomet or Loyola, and what will become of all the other sects who can never unite? George Whitefield was the charismatic preacher who is so superbly mocked in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. Of Franklin, it seems almost certainly right to say that he was an atheist, Jerry Weinberger's excellent recent study, Benjamin Franklin Unmasked, being the best reference here. But the master tacticians of church-state separation, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, were somewhat more opaque about their beliefs. In passing the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, the basis of the later First Amendment, they brilliantly exploited the fear that each Christian sect had of persecution by the others. It was easier to get the squabbling factions to agree on no tithes than it would have been to get them to agree on tithes that might also benefit their doctrinal rivals. In his famous Wall of Separation letter, assuring the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, of their freedom from persecution, Jefferson was responding to the expressed fear of this little community that they would be oppressed by the Congregationalists of Connecticut. This same divide-and-rule tactic may have won him the election of 1800 that made him president in the first place. In the face of a hysterical Federalist campaign to blacken Jefferson as an infidel, the Voltaire of Monticello appealed directly to those who feared the arrogance of the Presbyterians. Adams himself thought that this had done the trick. "With the Baptists, Quakers, Methodists and Moravians," he wrote, "as well as the Dutch and the German Lutherans and Calvinists, it had an immense effect, and turned them in such numbers as decided the election. They said, 'Let us have an atheist or deist, or anything, rather than an establishment of Presbyterianism.'" The essential point, that a religiously neutral state is the chief guarantee of religious pluralism, is the one that some of today's would-be theocrats are determined to miss. Brooke Allen misses no chance to rub it in, sometimes rather heavily stressing contemporary faith-based analogies. She is especially interesting on the extent to which the founders felt obliged to keep their doubts on religion to themselves. Madison, for example, did not find himself able, during the War of 1812, to refuse demands for a national day of prayer and fasting, but he confided his own reservations to his private papers, published as detached memoranda only in 1946. It was in those pages, too, that he expressed the view that to have chaplains opening Congress or chaplains in the armed forces was unconstitutional. Of all these pen portraits of religious reservation, the one most surprising to most readers will probably be that of George Washington. While he was president, he attended the Reverend James Abercrombie's church, but on sacramental Sundays left the congregation immediately before the taking of communion. When reproached for this by the good Reverend, he acknowledged the reproof, and ceased attending church at all on those Sundays which featured the Lord's Supper. To do otherwise, as he put it, would be an ostentatious display of religious zeal arising altogether from his elevated station. Jefferson was content to take part in public religious observances and to reserve his scorn and contempt for Christianity for his intimate correspondence. But our first president would not give an inch to hypocrisy. In that respect, if in no other, the shady, ingratiating Parson Weems had him right. In his 1784 book, Reason, the Only Oracle of Man, Ethan Allen wrote, "The doctrine of the Incarnation itself and the Virgin Mother does not merit a serious confutation, and therefore is passed in silence, except the mere mention of it." John Adams was prepared to be a little more engaged with theological subjects in which he possessed a huge expertise, but he also reposed his real faith in the bedrock of reason. "Human understanding," he wrote, seemingly following David Hume, "is its own revelation, and has made it certain that 2 and 1 make 3, and that 1 is not 3, nor can 3 be 1. Miracles or prophecies might frighten us out of our wits, might scare us to death, might induce us to lie, to say that we believe that 2 and 2 make 5. But we should not believe it. We should know the contrary." From David Hume, via ridicule of the Trinity, to a prefiguration of Winston Smith. The connection between religious skepticism and political liberty may not be as absolute as that last allusion implies, but there's no doubt that some such connection existed very vividly in the minds of those men of the Enlightenment who adorned Philadelphia and Boston and New York and Washington as the 18th century evolved into the 19th. In a first-class closing chapter on the intellectual and scientific world that shaped the framers, Allen discusses the wide influence then exerted by great humanist thinkers like Hume, Shaftesbury, Bolingbroke, Locke, and Voltaire. It became a point of principle as well as of practice to maintain that liberty of conscience and the freedom of the individual were quite incompatible with any compulsion in religion, just as they would be incompatible with any repression of belief. This is precisely why the French Revolution, which seemed to negate the promise of enlightenment, was to become such a painful cause of disagreement, and worse, between Federalists and Republicans. In 1821, Thomas Jefferson wrote of his hope that the human mind will someday get back to the freedom it enjoyed 2,000 years ago. This country, which has given the world an example of physical liberty, owes to it that of moral emancipation also. I think that Allen is not wrong in comparing this to the finest passages in Edward Gibbon. She causes us to catch our breath at the thought that, at the birth of the United States, there were men determined to connect it to a philosophical wisdom that predated the triumph of monotheism. It is the only reason for entertaining the belief that America was ever blessed by Providence, as Roger Williams named his open-minded settlement in Rhode Island, a refuge from the tyranny of Pilgrims and Puritans. In a time when the chief declared enemy of the American experiment is theocratic fanaticism, we should stand together and demand, Mr. Jefferson, build up that wall. The Private Jefferson. Review of Jefferson's Secrets, Death and Desire at Monticello by Andrew Burstein. The Wilson Quarterly, Spring 2005. It is arguably a good thing, and in no way detracts from Andrew Burstein's absorbing book, that Jefferson's Secrets does not quite live up to its title. Secrecy, death, and desire are the ingredients of the sensational, even of the violent, and they consort ill with the measure and scruple for which Thomas Jefferson is still renowned. It might be better to say that this study is an inquiry into the privacy and reticence of a very self-contained man, along with an educated speculation upon the motives and promptings for his defensive style. Celebrated for many paradoxes, Jefferson was especially notable as a revolutionary who believed above all in order. Often ardent in his partisanship for rebellion in America and France, though somewhat less so when it came to slave revolts in Haiti and the Old South, he could seem airy and promiscuous with regard to violence. Indeed, he rather commended the Whiskey Rebellion as something desirable for its own sake, like a storm in the atmosphere. Yet this expression in itself furnishes us with a clue. The outbreak of insurrection, like a storm, was necessary to restore normality by relieving unnatural pressure. The wisdom of nature had provided such outlets precisely in order to forestall or to correct what Jefferson was wont to call, always pejoratively, convulsions. Burstein, a professor of history at the University of Tulsa, acutely makes the connection between what men of the Enlightenment considered the body politic and what they thought about bodily health. Here the maxim mens sana in corpore sano was taken very seriously. Excess was to be avoided, in diet and in matters sexual, but so too was undue repression or continence. A true philosophe ought to spend as much time in exercise and labour as he did with books and papers. He should emulate the balance and symmetry of nature. He should be careful about what he put into his system and cautious about any fluid disbursements from it. As president, Jefferson began to suffer intermittently from diarrhea, which he at first cured by what seems the counterintuitive method of hard horseback riding. And though he was unusually hale until his 80th year, it was diarrhea and a miserable infection of the urinary tract that eventually carried him off. In one of his few profitless speculations, Burstein quotes a letter from one of Jefferson's physicians, Dr. Thomas Watkins, whose middle name was Gassaway, in which gonorrhea is mentioned as a possible cause of the persistent dysuria. It seems plain from the context that Jefferson had not contracted gonorrhea, but rather suffered from the traditional woes of an old man's prostate. Dr. Watkins was eliminating gonorrhea as a possible cause, not diagnosing it. However, the question of Jefferson's sex life does have to be raised at some point. Here again we find a man who was afraid in almost equal measure of too much gratification and too little. His letters from France contain many warnings of the sexual traps set by Parisian females for unwary and innocent Americans. Yet it was his own time in France that saw Jefferson at his most vulnerable and impassioned. I still remember the slight shock I experienced when I read a letter he wrote in Paris to Maria Cosway, full of rather clumsy phallic jokes borrowed from Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy. And it must have been in Paris that he first had carnal knowledge of Sally Hemings, who was his late wife's half-sister, as well as his own personal property. Burstein's chapter on this matter, which is, after all, a fairly open secret, is admirable. He doesn't waste time, as so many historians have, in making a mystery where none exists. It's obvious, without any reference to DNA testing, that Jefferson took Sally Hemings as his concubine and fathered several of her children. And if we look at the books in Jefferson's library, and study the opinions he uttered on related matters, we can readily see how he would have justified the arrangement to himself. First came the question of bodily integrity. The leading expert on sexual health at the time, the Swiss physician Samuel Tissot, took the view that intercourse of any kind was far less ignoble and life-threatening than masturbation. Semen was provided for a purpose, and should be neither squandered nor pent up. Knowing, and doubtless appreciating this, Jefferson had nonetheless to protect the memory of his wife and avoid scandal in general. As he was well aware, the ancient Greek method of doing both these things, and of avoiding venereal disease in the bargain, was to establish a consistent relationship with a compliant member of the household. Et voilà! A small element of eugenics may have been involved too, since Jefferson also believed that it was necessary to people the earth, and that too many men of position wasted their generative urges on alliances with unfit women. The children he had with Hemmings were sturdy and smart, and they made very serviceable slaves on his near-bankrupt estate until he kept his promise to their mother to manumit them at adulthood. Jefferson applied to himself the same method of analysis he employed for scrutinizing the universe and for anatomizing his beloved Virginia. Surely such symmetry and order implied a design, and therefore a designer? This deistic rationalism was as far as most thinking people could go in an epoch that just preceded the work of Charles Darwin, who was born on the same day as Abraham Lincoln. And Jefferson hit on the same analogy arrived at by the natural philosopher William Paley, the timepiece. Even a person who did not know what a clock was for would be able to tell that it was not a vegetable or a stone, that it had a maker. Interestingly, Jefferson made more use of this example as he got older, referring to himself as an old watch, with a pinion worn here and a wheel there, until it can go no longer. Did he think that a creator's global creation was subject to similar laws? He appears not to have asked himself. But then this was a man who could oppose the emancipation of slaves because he feared the 10,000 recollections they would retain of their hated condition, while almost in the same breath saying dismissively that their griefs are transient. In other words, and despite his notable modesty and decorum, Jefferson was subject to the same solipsism that encumbered all those who lived before the conclusive analysis of the fossil record and the elements of microbiology. He could never work out, in his notes on the state of Virginia, how it was that seashells could be found so high up on the local mountains. On his Monticello mountaintop, he was the centre of a universe of his very own, and he was never quite able to dispense with the corollary illusions. This is what makes the account of his death so impressive. He wished to make a good and dignified end, and to be properly remembered for his proudest achievements. Yet he seems to have guessed, telling John Adams that he felt neither hope nor fear, that only extinction awaited him. He certainly did not request the attendance of any minister of religion. Burstein reproduces a verse of revolting sentimentality composed by Jefferson on his deathbed, in which he promises his surviving daughter to bear her love to the two seraphs who have gone before. The lines seem ambivalent to me, in that Jefferson speaks not so much of crossing a boundary as of coming to an impassable one. I go to my fathers, I welcome the shore, which crowns all my hopes and which buries my cares. Anyway, a moment's thought will remind us that a designer who causes the deaths of infant daughters to occur so long before the death of their father has lost hold of the argument from natural order, while a moment's ordinary sympathy will excuse the dying and exhausted man this last indulgence in the lachrymose. The rest of Burstein's book has already demonstrated the main and unsurprising point, which is that the author of the Declaration of Independence was in every respect a mammal like ourselves. The only faint cause of surprise is that this can still seem controversial.